May of 1945 arrived heavy with heat and silence in a prisoner of war camp tucked among Mississippi cotton fields. The war in Europe was over, but no one inside the barbed wire felt victorious. In the mess hall, long wooden tables bore metal trays and steaming pots, and the smell of boiled vegetables mixed with damp earth and sweat. 3 German women sat shoulder to shoulder at the far end, their uniforms faded, their hair pulled back with trembling fingers. When the American cook placed ears of corn before them, they stared as if confronted by something unreal. Ilse was the first to lift one. Her hands were scarred from months of labor and transport, yet she cradled the corn carefully, almost reverently. Back home, before everything collapsed, this was feed for animals, something given to pigs and cattle when grain ran low. Marta swallowed hard, her throat tightening as the memory surfaced uninvited. Frida pressed her lips together, fighting the instinct to scoff. Instead, tears slid down her cheeks and dropped onto the rough tabletop. The room hummed with quiet movement. American guards paused, unsure whether to intervene. Other prisoners watched from their benches, confused by the sudden emotion. Ilse bit into the corn. Warmth and sweetness flooded her mouth, richer than anything she could remember eating since the war began. The taste shattered something inside her. She bent forward, shoulders shaking, and cried openly. Marta followed, then Frida, each sob pulled from a place deeper than hunger. It was not only the food, it was the realization that the world they had been taught to despise had chosen to nourish them. No shouting accompanied the meal, no punishment followed their tears. A young guard with sunburned arms stood nearby, awkwardly respectful, pretending not to notice. Outside, cicadas droned, indifferent to borders and uniforms. Ilse remembered speeches about strength and sacrifice, about enemies who lived in excess while Germany endured. Yet here, excess was simple kindness. Corn was plentiful, water was clean. No one struck them for speaking out of turn. The contradiction pressed down on her chest until breathing felt difficult. Marta whispered that she felt ashamed for ever mocking this food, for ever believing comfort meant weakness. Frida could not speak at all. Around them, the camp continued its routine, but for the 3 women, time seemed to stop. In that single shared moment, something shifted. The war had taken their homes, their certainty, and their youth. But this meal took their pride. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if learning how to be human again. The corn did not just fill their stomachs, it fed a fragile, terrifying hope that captivity might not be the end of their story, but the beginning of something they had never been allowed to imagine. That hope lingered in the air like steam, binding them together, and no fence, uniform, or memory of hatred could fully push it back into silence. For the first time, mercy tasted real. Snow had begun to fall in soft, defiant flakes the morning the world turned upside down. It was December of 1944, and the forest near Bastogne echoed with the thunder of artillery. German forces were in retreat, the front collapsing faster than anyone dared to admit. Among the scattered support units left behind were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, clerks, radio operators, medics, who had been assured they were far from the front. That lie vanished with the 1st American Patrol. Ilse, Marta, and Frida were captured together in a bombed-out farmhouse outside Clairvaux. They had been sleeping in shifts, taking turns keeping watch with a broken pistol and no ammunition. When the Americans arrived, rifles raised, none of the women resisted. What was there to fight for anymore? The Reich was crumbling. Orders no longer made sense. Surrender, when it came, felt like relief. The GIs were young, many barely older than the prisoners. One of them offered water. Another tied a tourniquet around a wounded girl's leg. There were no jeers, no revenge taken, just grim efficiency and the hollow fatigue of men who had seen too much. Stripped of weapons and insignia, the women were herded onto transport trucks. Ilse kept her jaw tight, eyes defiant. Marta wept silently, clutching a locket that held a photo of her brother lost at Stalingrad. Frida sat still as stone, arms wrapped around her ribs. No one spoke on the ride. They didn't know where they were going, only that it was away from everything they had known. They passed shattered villages and burning fields. Once they saw a line of German soldiers, young, dazed, already prisoners, walking with their hands on their heads. The sight hollowed them. The war they had served was ending not in triumph, but in humiliation. The uniform, once a symbol of purpose, now marked them as defeated. That night they were processed by Allied MPs in a temporary camp in France. Their names were taken, their belongings searched. Ilse's diary was confiscated. Frida flinched when a soldier reached for her scarf, but he returned it after inspection. Marta asked, in halting English, if they would be sent home. The answer was simple: eventually. But home was already a ghost. Rumors spread among the prisoners: Berlin in ruins, Dresden flattened, parents dead or missing. The women clung to each other in the cold. There were no beds, just straw pallets and thin blankets. They shared what warmth they had, whispering stories from before the war, as if trying to remember who they had been. No one came to rescue them. No orders arrived. They were no longer soldiers, just women in coats too big, boots too thin, and futures too uncertain. And so they waited in silence, surrounded by snow, each breath a fragile question the wind refused to answer. It began with a name they had never heard before: Mississippi. A new list had been posted outside the barracks, in chalk, barely legible under the frost. Ilse, Marta, and Frida were among 27 names marked for transport. The whispers spread quickly across the sea to America. No one had expected it. Some laughed bitterly, others stared at the list as if it were a death sentence. Ilse folded her arms and muttered that at least it would be warm. Within hours, they were marched to a nearby rail depot, under guard. The journey south to the French coast was long and bitterly cold. Cattle cars, no windows, the stench of too many bodies pressed together. Rations were sparse: cold bread, water in dented canteens, and silence heavy enough to choke on. Frida began coughing, a low rasp in her chest that worsened with each mile. At Le Havre, they saw the ocean for the first time. Gray and endless, it stretched out like an accusation. American soldiers herded them up the gangplank of a troop ship. The deck groaned beneath their boots. Below, the ship's belly was dark and narrow, packed with bunk cots and metal walls that echoed every whisper. It reeked of oil, seawater, and fear. Ilse claimed the bottom bunk, curled on her side. Marta stayed close, brushing her friend's damp hair away from her face. Frida sat up against the wall, sleepless, the cough rattling deeper. The sea tossed the ship like a toy. A few women cried out in the dark, not from pain, but from the slow erosion of hope. They were allowed on deck once a day. Guards stood at intervals with rifles, but their expressions were bored, not hostile. On the fourth day, one handed Marta a blanket when he saw her shiver. She didn't thank him, but she held on to the warmth. Crossing the Atlantic took nearly 2 weeks. Time warped in the gloom. The women spoke less each day. Ilse kept count on her palm with nail scratches, refusing to let the days disappear without mark. Marta wrote names in her mind, over and over. Frida hummed lullabies between coughs. Then one morning, land appeared, a hazy coastline rising from mist. The ship groaned into harbor, and the loudspeaker announced their arrival. "Mississippi," one guard repeated. "You'll be safe now." The word safe landed like a foreign object in the women's minds. They disembarked into light so blinding it hurt to open their eyes. The air was thick, fragrant with something sweet and strange. They were loaded onto trucks again, driving past fields of something tall and green. "Corn," someone whispered. Ilse looked out the slats, eyes narrowing. In Germany it was feed. Here it was everywhere. They didn't know then that this crop, more than anything, would change them. The camp was surrounded by fields, cotton, sugarcane, and miles of corn swaying beneath the southern sun. Set far from any town, it stood like a forgotten outpost of war, enclosed by barbed wire and guarded watchtowers. The barracks were wooden, 2 stories, clean but bare. The women were issued uniforms without insignia, gray shirts, work pants, and soft canvas shoes. Their German ranks no longer mattered. The Mississippi heat smothered them. Marta fainted within the first hour, unused to the weight of the air. Frida's cough deepened, made worse by the pollen and humidity. Ilse refused to ask for help, biting her tongue until it bled. They were marched, not roughly, to the mess hall, where their first American meal was served: collard greens, baked beans, soft white bread, and unfamiliar yellow chunks on a tray. Cornbread. Frida stared at it like it might be poisoned. Ilse poked it with her fork and muttered that, in Bavaria, pigs wouldn't touch this. Marta, too tired to argue, took a bite. It crumbled like sand, but melted on her tongue. She blinked, chewed again, said nothing. The guards watched, curious but silent. One of them, a lanky man with kind eyes, offered them more. Frida hesitated, then took it. The others followed. No one spoke for a while. Later in the barracks, Ilse leaned against the wall and whispered that the Americans were strange, too kind, too quiet. Where was the gloating? Where was the vengeance? Marta shrugged, wrapping her arms around herself. Frida coughed and whispered she missed the snow. Over the next days they were assigned tasks: kitchen duty, laundry, gardening. Work was steady, not cruel. The guards didn't leer or bark. Some even nodded good morning. At first the women kept their heads down, clinging to their German identity like armor. But small things began to wear it down. A nurse cleaned Frida's cracked hands with salve and bandaged them gently. Marta was given extra blankets. Ilse saw one of the guards feeding a stray dog outside the gate. At night, crickets sang. The air smelled of earth and rain. It felt nothing like prison. They didn't understand it yet, but something was beginning. Not freedom, not exactly. But the edge of something softer, something dangerous, something they'd been taught to fear: kindness. One afternoon during their shift near the mess hall, the women heard music drifting from the staff quarters, slow, twangy, full of longing. An American song, unfamiliar and gentle. Frida stopped sweeping and just listened. "They play music," she said softly, almost to herself. Ilse muttered, "Even animals like to hum," but her voice lacked conviction. As evening came, the women sat on the steps of their barracks and watched lightning bugs spark in the humid air. The world around them was wide, strange, and impossibly green. They had landed in the belly of their enemy's land, and yet no one screamed at them. No one struck them. The cornfields rustled in the wind. The real confusion had only just begun. Ilse had expected cold stares, taunts, maybe worse. Instead, she found something more confusing: indifference, politeness. The guards at Camp Ashton kept their distance, but treated the German women like people, not enemies. Meals were served on time. Work details were fair. Even punishments, rare as they were, came with explanation, not fury. Frida couldn't stop coughing. One morning in the mess line, she doubled over, wheezing so hard her knees buckled. Before anyone could react, a young American guard stepped forward. He caught her by the elbow, steadied her, and without a word, handed her his own tin mug filled with warm water. She looked at him like he was offering her fire. Later, the same guard brought a folded blanket to her bunk. It smelled of soap and sun. Frida held it to her face like it was something sacred. When Marta asked what he said, Frida shook her head. "Nothing," she whispered. "He just looked like he cared." Ilse didn't trust it. She watched everything. Watched how the guards let the women walk the yard without shouting. Watched how one officer paused while a prisoner tied her shoelace. Back in Germany, there had been rules, strictness, order. Here, there was patience. It made her uneasy. Marta found herself watching the nurses. One, a woman named Helen, always seemed to hum under her breath as she worked. One afternoon, when Marta was helping fold linens in the infirmary, Helen handed her a hair tie and said, "You look too young to have the world on your shoulders." Marta didn't know how to answer, so she smiled, weak and confused. In the evenings, the women sat outside the barracks in silence. Fireflies blinked in the grass. The cicadas never stopped. It felt like another planet. Ilsa still couldn't bring herself to eat the cornbread, but Frida asked for seconds now, and Marta whispered that she liked the beans. There was talk among the prisoners that this wasn't real, that one day it would all shift, that the Americans would show their true face. But each morning came the same. No beatings, no screaming, just the clatter of trays, the scrape of boots on wood, and the wind moving through cornfields. Ilsa tried not to let her guard down. She sharpened her thoughts like knives, telling herself not to soften. But even she couldn't deny something had changed when she saw a group of guards standing under a pecan tree, listening while a prisoner sang a German lullaby. One of them even tapped his foot. They had entered this place expecting to be hated. Instead, they were being forgotten, or worse, forgiven. It unsettled them more than punishment. For women trained to see enemies, kindness was not comfort. It was disarming. It peeled back defenses without ever lifting a weapon. And that, Ilsa thought bitterly, was far more dangerous than war. The first time the corn appeared on their trays, Ilsa laughed. It wasn't a joyful sound, more like disbelief wrapped in exhaustion. The ears were whole, glistening with steam, butter melting into golden grooves. She picked hers up between two fingers like it was filth. "We use this to feed animals," she muttered in German. A guard passing nearby glanced at her. Daniel. He was young, freckles across his nose, accent like molasses. Without slowing, he said, "Then I guess y'all were feeding 'em well," and walked on. Ilsa blinked, unsure if he was mocking her or not. The other women didn't laugh. Marta stared at the corn as if it might vanish. Frida picked hers up slowly, lips pressed tight. They hadn't seen food like this in years. Back home, hunger had become a quiet companion, bread stretched with sawdust, potatoes rationed until children stopped growing, and corn, whole corn, fresh corn, had been grown only for the livestock. Eating it now felt like a betrayal of everything they had known. Frida took the first bite. Her eyes widened. Then they watered. She chewed slowly, reverently. Marta followed, then Ilsa, finally giving in. The warmth spread through her mouth, sweet and simple, and yet she felt no comfort, only confusion. At dinner, the corn returned. This time, no one said anything. Marta ate in silence, eyes closed. Frida wiped tears from her cheeks between bites. Ilsa kept her head down. Across the room, Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching them without judgment, just curiosity. That night, Ilsa sat on the barrack steps, arms around her knees. The stars were out, scattered like dust. She thought of her family's farm, of the pigs they'd fed with buckets of yellow kernels, of how she'd once mocked American food as excessive, grotesque. Now she cried over a vegetable. The night air was warm, thick with the scent of cut grass and slow-burning wood smoke from a guard's cigarette somewhere in the dark. It wrapped around her like a blanket she hadn't asked for. She heard footsteps. Daniel approached, but didn't sit. He offered her a small cloth bag. Inside were dried corn kernels. "For planting," he said. "Spring's coming." Then he walked away. Ilsa stared at the seeds in her palm. They were hard, golden, lifeless. And yet they held the promise of something more. She closed her hand around them. In the days that followed, the corn became more than food. It was a symbol, a quiet test, a lesson. The guards kept serving it. The women kept eating it. No more jokes, no more scoffs. Just the slow realization that survival was reshaping them, one bite at a time. Corn was for pigs, once. Now it was for the broken, for the rebuilding. It was nourishment, not just of the body, but of something deeper. Ilse didn't say that out loud, but she stopped laughing. Words had become slippery. German didn't quite fit this place, and English still felt like a locked door. The guards spoke it like syrup, slow and thick, the vowels stretching in unfamiliar ways. The women whispered in German among themselves, but even that language, once precise and ordered, began to feel brittle. Frida's cough worsened. Each morning it echoed through the barracks, ragged and wet. One morning, Daniel brought her a steaming mug of something dark. "Herbal tea," he said slowly. Frida stared at him, confused. He gestured, "Drink," then coughed theatrically and smiled. She blinked, nodded, and sipped. The taste was bitter, earthy, unfamiliar, but her throat loosened. She looked up, whispered, "Danke." Daniel tapped his chest. "You're welcome." Later, she tried to repeat the phrase to Marta, mimicking his accent. It made them laugh, quietly, the way children laugh when they discover a secret. Daniel began leaving small notes, English words with German translations. Bread equals Brot. Warm equals warm. Safe equals sicher. The handwriting was blocky but careful. Ilse found one tucked in her bunk. Strong equals stark. She didn't smile, but she kept the paper. Marta was the first to begin trying English out loud. "Thank you," she said to a nurse. "Please." "Good." It came haltingly, wrapped in nerves. But the nurses smiled, encouraged her, sometimes corrected her gently. In return, Marta began teaching the guards German phrases. "Guten Morgen." "Wie geht's?" One young soldier practiced until he could say, "My name is Joe," without pausing. He beamed like a child when he got it right. Language became a quiet bridge. Nothing official, no classes, just exchanges, moments, hands pointing to objects, laughter over mispronunciations. Frida began collecting the words in a notebook, writing in tight lines by candlelight. Ilse resisted at first. Language was power, and she was reluctant to surrender hers. But one afternoon, watching Marta trade phrases with Daniel near the garden, she felt something tug loose inside her. Maybe words didn't have to divide. Maybe they could be stitched together. Later that evening, Daniel handed Ilse a folded page. A drawing of a corn plant, labeled in English and German. She traced the lines with her finger, then whispered, "Thank you." He smiled. Language wasn't just about words. It was about presence, about seeing and being seen. They had arrived in this place as enemies, but through gestures, drawings, notes slipped under doors, they were beginning to be something else, not friends, not yet, but something human. That night, thunder rolled in the distance. Rain tapped gently on the tin roof as the women whispered strange new words in the dark, trying them on like borrowed coats. Hunger had first brought them to the table, but language, tentative and clumsy, was beginning to bring them to understanding. And in that fragile in-between, something like trust was beginning to grow. December arrived without snow, but the cold found them anyway. It slipped in through the floorboards, through the cracks in the windows, through the memories of what December was supposed to feel like. Back home, they would have lit candles, bundled in thick coats, sung carols by firelight. Here, they were wrapped in wool blankets too thin and surrounded by pine trees that smelled like resin and distance. There were no decorations, no wreaths, no songs. Until Captain Harris made an announcement, the prisoners would be allowed a Christmas gathering, not a celebration exactly. Just one night in the dining hall with permission to decorate with whatever they could scrounge. Paper, cloth, dried leaves. It wasn't kindness, he explained, just decency. Word spread fast. Some of the women were suspicious, others indifferent, but Marta's face lit up. She'd always loved Christmas, even in the war years when rationing turned gifts into promises and stockings into patchwork. She proposed cutting stars from old newspapers. Frida saved thread scraps from the infirmary. Ilse, skeptical but unwilling to ruin it, carved a makeshift angel from a lump of soap. On Christmas Eve they gathered in the dining hall. The guards stood at the back, silent. Someone had hung a torn red curtain like a banner. On the tables were simple offerings: cornbread, stew, boiled apples, warm milk. Frida whispered that it smelled like a meal, not a ration. Then Marta stood. Her hands trembled as she lifted them, motioning to the women. "We'd like to sing," she said softly in English. Captain Harris gave a single nod. They began with O Tannenbaum, voices low, cautious. The harmony was imperfect but close enough. Then Ilse, surprising even herself, led the group into Stille Nacht. The room softened. A few guards shifted. Daniel leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching as if he'd never heard music before. And then Frida stepped forward. She held up a crumpled scrap of paper, lyrics she'd copied phonetically, and began to sing Silent Night in English. Her accent was heavy, the syllables off, but the tune was right. One by one the others joined. Some stumbled, others whispered. But the intent rang clear. By the time they finished, the room was silent. Not from discomfort, but reverence. Daniel clapped first, hesitant, soft. Then a few others followed. Marta bowed slightly, cheeks flushed. Ilse looked at the floor, unsure what she was feeling. Back in the barracks, no one spoke for a long time. The fire crackled low. Ilse ran her finger along the edge of her bunk and whispered. They clapped. Frida nodded, eyes glassy. They listened. That night, Marta wrote in the margins of her notebook, "It felt like we were people again. The barbed wire still stood. The guards still locked the gates. But for a single night, the women had sung not as prisoners or enemies, but as daughters, sisters, human beings remembering a world before sides were drawn. And in that remembrance, a small, flickering peace had been born." 2 days after Christmas, the mail came. A Red Cross liaison arrived in a dusty truck, carrying a canvas bag marked with the Geneva symbol. The guards helped unload it, dropping bundles of letters on the camp's makeshift desk. The women lined up, anxious, their eyes flickering with hope, too fragile to name. Frida's name was called first. Her hands shook as she took the envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, Red Cross script, not her mother's loops. She opened it slowly, scanning for names. The letter explained that her hometown of Dresden had suffered catastrophic bombing in February. Civilian casualties were high. Her parents unaccounted for. Her younger sister presumed dead. Frida folded the letter once, then again. Her eyes didn't move. Marta touched her elbow, but Frida said nothing, only walked back to the barracks and sat on her bunk, staring at the floor. The mug of tea Daniel brought later sat untouched by her side. The steam drifted up and disappeared, unnoticed. Ilse received a thin envelope marked Zurückgesandt. Empfänger unbekannt. Return to sender. Addressee unknown. Her parents had moved at some point during the late war, or died, or vanished. The letter she had written in September, full of carefully controlled words, had gone nowhere. It had floated into silence and come back unopened. Marta waited longer. Her name wasn't called. She asked twice. Each time the clerk shook his head. "Maybe next time," he said. She nodded, pretending it didn't matter, but her voice cracked when she sat down and whispered, "At least yours were returned. Mine. Mine are just lost." The barracks that night were silent in a different way, not sullen, hollow. The kind of silence that comes when the past finally lets go of its grip and drifts into fog. Each woman had arrived with an idea of home, a place they might return to once the war ended. That idea had been a thread, something to hold on to in the dark. Now that thread had snapped. Ilse sat with the returned letter in her lap, reading her own words as if they were written by someone else. Frida didn't speak at all. Marta wrote nothing in her notebook that night. Even the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like the world outside had grown larger while they'd grown smaller. Daniel didn't speak to them the next day, only nodded in quiet respect. Other guards kept their distance. They had seen this before, news from home that hollowed people out. Even enemies were allowed to grieve. That evening, Frida finally picked up the mug of cold tea and took a sip. She liked tea, she said softly. My sister. It was the first time she'd said anything since the letter. Ilse nodded. Marta offered a folded scarf to warm Frida's hands. No one tried to fix anything. There was nothing to fix, just the new knowledge of absence, and the quiet, unbearable company of it. Later that night, as rain ticked gently against the barracks windows, Marta whispered, "It feels like our homes are turning into stories." Frida closed her eyes. Or ghosts. Ilse said nothing, but she reached into her pocket and held the corner of her returned letter between two fingers, gripping it like a lifeline. Even in this quiet place, war could still find them, not with bullets or bombs, but with paper and silence. Spring crept into Mississippi slowly, almost shyly. Rain softened the hardened winter ground, and in the garden behind the camp's infirmary, green shoots began to break through the soil. The Americans called it planting season. To the German women, it was something else, something closer to memory, to muscle, to survival. The prisoners were assigned to the garden in rotating shifts. It was small, 3 rows of vegetables, a patch of wild herbs, and a corner where corn had already begun to grow again. Most of the women approached it as duty, heads down, hands calloused from months of work. But not Ilse. On her 3rd day in the garden, she stood still, staring at the corn stalks. They were young, delicate, not yet the towering plants she remembered. Still, the shape of them pulled something out of her. She walked over, dropped to her knees, and with slow, practiced hands began clearing the weeds that clung to their base. Daniel noticed. He was leaning against the fence, boots muddy, a clipboard under one arm. "Didn't think you liked corn," he called softly. She didn't look up. "In Germany it was for pigs," she said. Not with spite this time, but something closer to apology. "Well," Daniel replied, "guess you're feeding folks now." Ilse didn't answer. She dug deeper into the dirt, loosening roots, brushing aside pebbles. Her fingers moved instinctively, not needing instruction. Back home, she had helped her father tend a garden, not much larger than this. It was before the war, before uniforms, before speeches, before silence. That afternoon, she stayed longer than assigned. No one stopped her. When the sun dipped lower, she wiped her hands on her trousers and finally stood. Daniel hadn't moved. He offered her a tin canteen. "Water," he said. She took it. The next morning she returned early. Frida joined her, then Marta. Soon other women were asking for garden duty. It wasn't just the work, it was the quiet, the steadiness, a rhythm that asked nothing of politics or pain, just care, just patience. Captain Harris approved more tools. One of the nurses brought out a book on local plant life. The women began learning names: okra, collard greens, pole beans. Some they had never seen before. Some reminded them of home. Ilse was given the corner bed to manage. She chose corn. Daniel helped her dig furrows. They planted seeds together, not speaking, just working side by side. The corn from the previous harvest had fed them through winter. Now, the same women who had once laughed at it were cultivating it with reverence. Ilse tied twine between stakes to support the young stalks. She watched them stretch toward the sun. One day, she found a folded piece of paper pinned under a rock at the edge of the garden. It was a drawing, a sketch of a cornstalk, with a small heart beneath it. No name. But she knew the handwriting. She tucked the note into her pocket and went back to work. The camp was no longer just a place of confinement. It had begun to feel like a strange sort of school. Lessons weren't official, and no one sat in rows or raised their hands, but learning bloomed in small, unexpected places. It started with Marta. After Christmas, She had begun to string together English phrases, short ones at first. "Good morning, thank you, can I help?" She learned them from the guards, from the nurses, from signs posted on walls. When she made mistakes, the Americans corrected her gently. When she got it right, they smiled. That was enough. Soon, other women followed. They practiced in whispers, copying phrases into scraps of paper. Frida labeled objects in the barracks: door, tour, blanket, decca, cup, tassa. She used string to attach notes like a child learning to speak. The others chuckled, but they remembered the words. One evening, Marta offered to teach a few German words to the guards. Daniel joined first, curious. "How do you say shovel?" he asked, holding one up. "Schaufel," Marta said, smiling. He repeated it, badly. They laughed. Ilse watched from the corner, her expression unreadable. Language became currency, a way to trade something small for something human. One guard offered chocolate in exchange for a lesson in pronunciation. Another wanted to learn how to say good luck before his leave. Marta taught him, viel Glück. He wrote it on his helmet. Even Captain Harris began carrying a list of common phrases. It was a quiet shift, almost imperceptible. The enemy was becoming a neighbor, syllable by syllable. Ilse remained cautious. Language, she believed, could be a trap. Words had been used to manipulate, to rally, to blind. She'd seen what speeches could do, what uniformed promises could unleash. But when she saw Frida helping a nurse count supplies in both English and German, she softened. This wasn't politics. It was people. One night, Ilse sat outside alone, scribbling in a small notebook. She wrote out English verbs: to be, to know, to become. The last one she underlined twice. She said it aloud, slowly. To become. The next day she joined Marta and Daniel during their afternoon lesson. She didn't speak much, but when Marta said the word hope and pointed to the sky, Ilse repeated it. Later she found herself thinking about the word, not just its meaning, but how it felt in her mouth. Lighter than its German counterpart, softer, less certain. But maybe that was the point. She had always thought language was used to control, but now it was helping her connect. Every new word was like stepping into sunlight after months in a cellar. Language was no longer just a way to understand commands or make requests. It had become a tool for reshaping thought. It built bridges not just between speaker and listener, but between who they had been and who they might yet become. The projector whirred to life with a rattle that made every woman flinch. It was March of 1945, and the camp mess hall had been converted into a makeshift screening room. Wooden benches lined the floor. The women were ushered in quietly, uncertain. No one explained what they were about to see. Captain Harris simply stood beside the screen, arms crossed, and nodded at the technician to begin. The first images were black and white, grainy, unsteady. A barbed wire fence, skeletal figures in striped uniforms, a man too thin to stand, being lifted by another, a pile of bodies, then more, camps, rows of barracks, mass graves, guards with rifles. The name Buchenwald appeared on the screen, then Bergen-Belsen, then Dachau. At first the women sat in stunned silence. Frida gripped the edge of the bench so tightly her knuckles whitened. Marta leaned forward, blinking, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. Ilse stared without blinking at all. A fly buzzed near her cheek, and she didn't move. The footage grew worse. Naked bodies, twisted in ditches, children too small to speak, survivors with eyes like open wounds. An American soldier stood before the camera, his voice flat, explaining that these were not actors, these were not staged. These were camps liberated just days earlier. Someone behind them began to sob. Another woman turned away, pressing her face into her hands. Frida whispered, "No, no." Marta shook her head violently. "This isn't real," she said too loudly. But no one corrected her, because it was real. And it would go on playing whether they believed it or not. Ilse stood suddenly, knocking over the bench. She stumbled toward the side door, burst outside, and vomited into the grass. Daniel followed her, but didn't approach. He waited, hands in his pockets, as she crouched, retching, gasping, shaking. Back inside, the film ended in silence. No applause, no questions, just the low hum of the projector fan slowing to a stop. The lights came on gradually. The guard said nothing. They didn't need to. Later that evening, the women sat together on their bunks, not speaking. Frida finally whispered, "We didn't know." Marta whispered back, "But we were part of it." Ilsa didn't speak at all. She lay flat on her back, staring at the ceiling, as if it held some answer. She thought of her father, his quiet faith in Germany's cause, of speeches broadcast through radios in public squares, of uniforms passed down like tradition, of a world built on obedience. She had worn that uniform. She had believed. Now she didn't know what to believe, only that something inside her had broken, something she didn't want to mend. The next morning, Ilsa found a piece of chalk and wrote one word on the mess hall wall. Warum? Why? No one erased it. The photograph appeared 3 days later in a local Mississippi newspaper, a blurry black and white shot of 3 German women, Ilsa, Marta, and Frida, sitting under a tree near the camp's fence line. Sunlight slanted across their faces. Ilsa was laughing. Marta held a book. Frida, eyes closed, leaned into the warmth like someone remembering home. The headline read, "Nazi women sunbathe in comfort while American boys die in the Pacific." It spread fast. Copies were pinned to bulletin boards in town. A stack was left at the guardhouse. A copy made its way into Captain Harris's office, where he read it 3 times before folding it into his desk. The article accused the army of coddling prisoners. It questioned why enemy women, once part of Hitler's machine, were allowed leisure, comfort, even compassion. The comments were vicious. "Spoiled enemy girls," one reader wrote. "They should be digging graves, not picking flowers." That night, someone drove past the camp perimeter and threw rocks over the fence. One shattered a barracks window, another struck the water pump. No one was injured, but the message was clear. Outside the wire, forgiveness had a limit. Inside, the mood shifted. Guards became quieter. Civilians who once visited stopped coming. The women noticed. The friendliness they'd begun to trust now felt thin, strained. Frida caught Daniel looking at her during meal distribution, and this time he looked away. Ilsa was the first to speak. "We've been reminded," she said coldly, "that uniforms don't come off just because the war ends." Marta argued gently that not everyone saw them as monsters. Ilsa shook her head. "They see our faces and only remember the ones who stood in shadows with guns." Captain Harris addressed the women the next day. He didn't apologize. He didn't make promises. He only said this: "There's a world outside this fence that hasn't seen what we've seen in here. It hasn't listened to your songs or watched you work the garden. All it knows is what it remembers, and what it's lost." The women nodded. They understood. Understanding didn't make it easier. Work duties resumed, but laughter quieted. Language lessons slowed. Even Marta's notebook remained closed for 3 days. Frida cleaned the infirmary in silence, not looking up when the nurses passed. Ilsa spent her afternoons scrubbing the mess hall walls, including the one where she had written "Warum." She didn't erase the word, just cleaned around it. Every day more women came to help. The sun still rose. Meals were still served. But something had shifted. The illusion of safety had cracked. The realization set in that no matter how far they'd come inside the fence, outside, they were still the enemy. Marta wrote in the margins of her notebook that night, "Being better isn't always enough. Some people will never see who we are now, only who we used to be." Ilsa, sitting on her bunk, stared at the photograph for a long time. Not at herself, but at Frida's face, so peaceful, so unaware. "They think that moment was comfort," she whispered. "But it wasn't. It was the first time we weren't afraid." And that, she knew, was what frightened the world most. After the newspaper incident, after the rocks, after the silence, the women could have withdrawn, could have hardened again, could have let resentment retake the space kindness had briefly warmed. But something had changed too deeply to reverse. The shame of what they'd seen in the film reel, the coldness of the world outside the fence, the small, persistent gestures of humanity they'd received, it all planted seeds, and now they began to grow. Ilsa returned to the kitchen, not out of punishment but purpose. She scrubbed pots, peeled potatoes, organized shelves with a focus that bordered on obsession. Marta began mending uniforms, not their own, but the guards. She asked for a sewing kit and patches, and when one of the sergeants handed her a torn jacket, she accepted it without a word. Frida, though still coughing, asked to work again in the infirmary. Nurse Helen gave her back her stool by the supply shelf. She folded linens, prepared bandages, swept the floor 3 times more than necessary. When the head nurse told her to rest, Frida only said, "I need to do something useful." The transformation wasn't declared. No meeting was held. No one asked them to change. They simply began to act. Other women followed. Maria, once a file clerk in Hamburg, organized the camp's record room. Greta, who rarely spoke, began repairing broken tools. She fixed a snapped broom handle with string and glue from the art room and handed it to a guard without being asked. He looked stunned, then nodded. There were setbacks, of course. Not every guard welcomed the efforts. Some remained distant, skeptical. One muttered, "Too little, too late," when Ilsa offered to carry trays. Another refused to eat anything a prisoner had helped prepare, but others noticed, and they adjusted in quiet ways. Daniel started leaving extra buckets of water by the barracks. No explanation. Just there. Marta found a pair of soft gloves tucked into the sewing kit. No note. Frida opened her bunk drawer to find her missing scarf, washed and folded. She knew who had returned it. The most remarkable part was that the women didn't seem to be doing these things for approval. They weren't waiting for praise or expecting thanks. It was as if they had begun to understand that redemption wasn't a state of being. It was something you did, every day, in small ways, with clean hands, with tired feet, with quiet effort. Ilsa kept returning to the garden. Her corn stalks were rising fast now, shoulder high. She tied them to sticks and watched them lean toward the sun. Once Daniel joined her, crouched beside her row, and whispered, "You ever think about planting something back home?" She didn't answer, but her fingers kept working. That night Marta wrote again in her notebook, "Maybe redemption is not a gift. Maybe it's work you choose to do over and over until you believe it's real." By late May, the corn was ready. It had grown tall and golden, thick with promise, a harvest that didn't belong to anyone but somehow belonged to everyone. The stalks stood in perfect rows beside the barracks, their tassels reaching for the cloudless Mississippi sky. The women moved through them like they were walking through a cathedral. It wasn't just food, it was memory, apology, survival. One morning the kitchen served it. Fresh boiled ears on every tray, steam curled above them, butter pooled on the metal plates. It was the same corn they had helped plant, water, weed, and whisper to in early spring. Ilsa stared at hers. So did Frida and Marta. They didn't speak. They just held the corn in their hands for a long time, as if unsure whether to eat or pray. Then Frida took the first bite. Her eyes closed. Her lips trembled. Marta followed. Then Ilsa, slow and careful. The sweetness struck her like music. They began to cry, not all at once, not loudly, just soft tears that slid down their cheeks and disappeared into their collars. Guards stopped to watch. Other women did too. The room fell into a hush. A photographer, visiting from a military paper in Jackson, stood near the doorway with his camera. He had been there to document camp life, to counter the earlier scandal. He had not expected this, but he lifted his lens and clicked, once, then again. 3 women, eyes closed, holding corn like a sacrament, weeping into their meal. The photo would later appear in a different paper. No headline screamed, just a caption. Former enemies taste the first harvest of peace. The moment spread through the camp like fire, not with heat, but with warmth. The other women began to eat, slowly, reverently. Some laughed softly through their tears, others sat still, chewing in silence. It was more than corn, it was proof that something could be planted and cared for and brought to life, that hands once raised in salute could now cradle food, that those who had once served hatred could choose something else. Ilse finished first. She set her cob down gently, wiped her face, and looked across the table at Marta and Frida. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. Daniel approached quietly. He crouched beside their table and whispered, "It tastes different when you grow it yourself." Ilse nodded. "It tastes like something we thought we didn't deserve." Marta whispered, "But maybe now we do." Frida didn't say anything. She simply reached across the table, took Marta's hand in one of hers and Ilse's in the other. And together they sat in that room. 3 women, once enemies, now breaking bread not with pride, not with shame, but with the quiet understanding that change sometimes begins with the smallest thing placed in your hands. The decision didn't begin with speeches or plans. It began with silence, with stolen glances and hesitant questions passed between bunks. It began with women lying awake, staring at the wooden ceiling of the barracks, asking themselves the question they were afraid to say aloud. What would we even go back to? Germany was in ruins. Dresden had been reduced to ash. Hamburg was a hollowed shell. Letters from home were still scarce, and those that arrived often brought more uncertainty than relief. Families had vanished, streets had changed, a homeland wasn't always a home, and America, strange and foreign as it still was, had become a place of routine, of meaning, of rebirth. Marta was the first to speak the thought aloud. One evening, after a long day in the laundry room, she sat cross-legged on her bunk and whispered to Ilse and Frida, "What if we didn't go back?" Ilse blinked. "What do you mean?" "Stayed," Marta said, barely above a breath. "Here, in America." Frida laughed softly, not in ridicule, but disbelief. "They'd never let us." "Maybe," Marta replied, "but maybe they would if we asked." The next day, she spoke with Nurse Helen, not officially, just in passing, just enough to gauge a reaction. If someone didn't want to return to Germany, she asked carefully, would there be another choice? Helen didn't answer at first. Then she said, "You'd need a reason. A good one. And someone willing to listen." That night, Marta began to write. The petition was simple, handwritten in her best English, with careful grammar and humble tone. It explained that a group of German women, non-combatants, captured while serving in auxiliary roles, wished to remain in the United States, not as prisoners, not as dependents, but as residents, workers, neighbors. It listed their efforts: kitchen shifts, infirmary support, gardening, sewing, translation. It admitted the crimes of their homeland and acknowledged the women's desire to build something better. By the end of the week, 9 women had signed. Captain Harris was silent as he read it. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were unreadable. "You understand," he said, "this is unprecedented." Marta nodded. "So is everything about this war." He kept the paper. "I'll forward it to Washington. Don't expect a quick reply." Word spread through the camp. Some women scoffed. Some were angry. Others watched the signers with quiet awe. It wasn't defiance, it was something more dangerous. Hope. The guards noticed too. Daniel pulled Ilse aside. "Is this real?" She nodded. "And if they say no?" "Then we leave," she said. "But we had to ask." Weeks passed. No response came. But something shifted. The guards treated the women with a new kind of quiet respect. Civilians from nearby churches sent letters of support after hearing rumors. One family, the Hendersons, visited and asked to sponsor a woman named Anna, who had helped nurse their youngest son after a farm accident. The Red Cross confirmed that if classified as displaced persons, some POWs could apply for residency. It wouldn't be easy, but it wasn't impossible. Inside the fence, the petitioners worked harder than ever. Ilse doubled her hours in the kitchen. Marta helped translate medical reports. Frida taught basic German to a new batch of American soldiers preparing for occupation duty in Europe. They weren't just waiting, they were proving. Then, one morning, a wire arrived. Washington had received the petition. Consideration was underway. No promises, no guarantees. But for the first time, the idea was real. That night, the women gathered near the cornfield. The stalks rustled in the breeze. Fireflies blinked like nervous hearts. No one celebrated, but they smiled, small, weary smiles. And in that moment, without saying a word, they knew they had already begun to stay. The official word from Washington arrived in mid-June. It came in a sealed envelope, delivered by a courier, with the flat expression of someone who didn't know what he was carrying. Captain Harris read it alone in his office, lips pressed thin, eyes scanning each line twice. The War Department's answer was carefully worded. The German women could not remain as prisoners. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. However, those with no homes to return to, and who could secure a sponsor and demonstrate purpose, could be reclassified as displaced persons and apply for immigration under special provisions. The government would not make promises, but neither would it forbid possibility. It was, in essence, a door, narrow, bureaucratic, but open. Captain Harris called the petitioners into the mess hall and read the statement aloud. Marta's hands trembled. Frida wept openly. Ilse said nothing, but her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. They had a chance. That's all they had ever asked for. In the days that followed, the camp transformed. Paperwork flowed. Letters were written. Local families came forward. Churchgoers, farmers, nurses who had seen the women's work. Sponsors were secured, job offers drafted, volunteer hours recorded. Marta received a letter from the Hendersons, offering her a place in their home and a job at the town library. Ilse was approached by a baker who had heard about her discipline in the kitchen. Frida, whose cough had improved, was offered training at a local hospital. The women gathered each night in the barracks, reviewing forms, practicing English, ironing their plainest clothes. They spoke of cities they had never seen, of jobs they hadn't dared to dream of. Not as escape, but as rebuilding. Not as reward, but as repentance. Not all chose to stay. Some women, even among the original 9, backed away. The unknown was too large. The idea of starting over in a country where they had once been called enemy, too painful. 5 of the signers remained. The rest chose repatriation. Their decisions were respected. The camp prepared 2 departures, one for those returning to Germany, one for those staying. On the morning of the final decision, the sun rose soft and golden. Marta stood at the cornfield edge, holding a small suitcase. Ilse stood beside her, arms crossed, face set. Frida clutched her scarf and looked toward the gate. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because somehow, without ceremony, without orders, without flags, they had redefined what home meant. It wasn't where they were born, it was where they had been broken, where they had chosen to change, where they had begun again. June 20th, 1945. The camp stirred earlier than usual. Uniforms were brushed, hair tied back, suitcases packed with items too modest to carry the weight they held, scarves, letters, folded drawings, pressed flowers between notebook pages. The air was heavy with something that wasn't quite sorrow, but not joy either. It was something quieter, a kind of reverence for the life that had happened between fences. At one end of the yard stood the transport truck, idling softly. A group of 46 women stood beside it, those bound for repatriation. Their faces were solemn, their shoulders squared. They would return to a country they no longer recognized, carrying stories no one might believe. Still, they chose to go, out of duty, out of hope, out of longing. At the other end stood 5 women, Marta, Ilse, Frida, and 2 others whose names would rarely appear in history books, but whose decision was just as brave. They carried small bags, papers, sponsorship letters, and inside a deep, uncertain faith that what had begun here could become something lasting. Captain Harris stood between the groups. He looked older than he had months before, the lines around his eyes deeper. He cleared his throat and addressed them not as captives, not as the enemy, but as people. "You arrived here because of war," he said, "but how you leave is your own doing. Some of you are returning to rebuild. Others are staying to begin again. Both paths are honorable. Both are yours." No applause followed, just a long silence, thick with goodbye. Ilse stepped forward. Her voice was steady. "We came here believing we understood the world, that we knew who we were, but the world we served no longer exists, and who we are," she looked at Marta, then Frida, "has changed, not because we were forced, but because we were fed something we didn't expect." Marta nodded. "Kindness," she said, "work, music, language, and yes, corn." Frida smiled softly. "We were fed more than food." The women boarding the truck hugged those who stayed. Tears came, but no one wailed. They weren't being torn apart. They were scattering seeds. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, those remaining turned and walked toward the main gate, not as prisoners, but as something else. The guard on duty nodded, opened it, and let them through. Outside the fence, the road stretched wide and blinding in the morning sun. A car waited to take Marta to the Hendersons, another for Frida. Ilse's sponsor, the baker, stood nearby holding a sign with her name, written in careful English block letters. They didn't look back. Years later, a photo would hang in a small museum in Mississippi. 3 women sitting at a table, holding ears of corn, tears on their cheeks. The caption would read, "They were fed more than food. Ilse would become a cook, Marta a librarian, Frida a nurse. They would speak fluent English, pay taxes, and teach children how to plant seeds." Some of those children would ask what it meant to be an enemy, and sometimes, when the timing was right, the women would answer, not with blame, not with bitterness, but with truth. And the memory of a meal that changed everything.